Fight Part 1. Shocking hook. Word count. 450 words. She stood in that pawn shop, holding her father's old boxing gloves, asking for just $100. The clerk barely looked up, but then the door opened, and the man who walked in made her freeze. What happened next left everyone in that shop speechless. The leather was cracked, worn thin in places where fists had connected with bags, with pads, with dreams that never quite made it to the big time. She turned them over in her hands. These gloves that had seen 1,000 rounds, 1,000 mornings, in gyms that smelled like sweat and determination. Her fingers traced the stitching along the wrist straps. Her father's hands had been in these gloves. His sweat had darkened this leather. His blood from split knuckles and hard sparring sessions had stained the interior padding that she couldn't see but knew was there. $100. That's all she needed. Just $100 to keep the lights on for another month. To buy herself enough time to figure out what came next. To hold on to the last shred of dignity she had left after 3 months of drowning in bills she couldn't pay, and a grief she couldn't escape. The clerk didn't understand. How could he? To him, these were just old gloves. Used equipment, something that had seen better days, and was now taking up space in someone's life who needed cash more than memories. He offered 80. She asked for 100. He shook his head, and that's when everything changed. The bell above the door rang. That old brass bell that hadn't been replaced since the shop opened in 1967. It had announced thousands of customers, thousands of transactions, desperate people trading pieces of their lives for money they needed more than sentiment. But this time was different. She didn't look up immediately. She was too focused on keeping herself together, too focused on not breaking down right there in front of a stranger who had already shown her that her father's legacy was worth $20 less than she needed to survive. The clerk's face changed. His eyes widened. His posture straightened. She noticed it in her peripheral vision, that sudden shift in the room's energy. Like someone important had just entered, someone who commanded respect without saying a word. She turned slowly, and her breath stopped. The man standing near the door was tall, older but powerful in the way he carried himself. He wore a dark tracksuit and sunglasses, a cap pulled low over his face. But even with those things hiding his features, there was something unmistakable about him. Something legendary. He looked around the shop slowly, taking it in. His gaze swept past dusty shelves, past forgotten instruments and jewelry that had stories no one would ever hear. And then his eyes landed on her, on the gloves in her hands. And in that moment, before a single word was spoken, she knew that nothing would ever be the same. Club, Part 2, Location and Power Setup, Word Count, 650 words. The pawn shop sat on a quiet corner in Louisville, Kentucky. Dust floated through the afternoon light, the hum of an old fan, a bell above the door that hadn't been oiled in years. The building itself was unremarkable. Brick facade, painted white sometime in the 80s, and now peeling in places where the Kentucky weather had worn it down. A faded sign hung above the entrance, Burke's Pawn and Loan since 1967. The neon open sign in the window flickered occasionally, threatening to give out completely but somehow never quite dying. Inside, the air was thick, not unpleasant, just heavy with age and stories. The scent of old leather mixed with dust, and the faint chemical smell of cleaning products the clerk used on the glass cases. Every morning, sunlight streamed through the front windows, illuminating thousands of tiny particles floating lazily through the space. The clerk, a man in his 60s named Richard Burke, third generation to run this shop, sat behind bulletproof glass that had been installed after an attempted robbery in 1989. He wore reading glasses that constantly slid down his nose, forcing him to push them back up every few minutes. His fingers were permanently stained with ink from the ledgers he still kept by hand, despite his grandson's insistence that he switch to computers. Richard had seen everything in this shop. Wedding rings from dissolved marriages, guitars from abandoned dreams of stardom, purple hearts from veterans who needed grocery money more than they needed medals. Each item carried weight. Each transaction was someone's story of desperation or transition or simple bad luck. The usual customers trickled in throughout the day. A young man with a PlayStation he'd probably bought just 6 months ago. An older woman with her late husband's watch collection. A college student with textbooks from last semester. It was just another Tuesday. The rhythm was predictable, the outcomes rarely surprising. Burke had learned long ago not to get emotionally involved. He made fair offers. He didn't judge. He provided a service that people needed, even if they didn't want to need it. But in the back corner, near a rack of forgotten leather jackets that had hung there so long they'd become part of the fixtures, stood a young woman who had been there for almost 20 minutes. Her name was Sarah. She wore a faded denim jacket with a small tear along the collar. Jeans that had been washed so many times they'd gone soft and thin at the knees. Boots that had walked too many miles on too many hard surfaces. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, revealing a face that was younger than her eyes suggested. In her hands she held a pair of boxing gloves. Old. Worn. The leather cracked in places where it had folded and unfolded thousands of times. The red color had faded to something closer to rust. The Everlast logo was barely visible, worn away by years of use. She turned them over slowly, running her thumb across the stitching that held the padding in place. Her jaw was tight, her eyes red-rimmed, like she'd been crying earlier that morning and was trying hard not to start again. Burke noticed her but didn't say anything yet. He'd seen this before, people bringing in their last piece of something precious, hoping desperately it was worth more than it probably was. He'd learned to give them time, let them have their moment before reality set in. Sarah took a deep breath, steadied herself, then she walked to the counter. Each step felt heavier than the last, each step closer to letting go of the last tangible piece of her father she had left. She placed the gloves on the counter between them. The leather made a soft sound against the glass. "How much for these?" she asked quietly. Her voice was steady, but Burke could hear the fracture beneath it, the effort it took to sound normal when everything inside was breaking. Part 3, The Woman and Unseen Struggle. Word count, 800 words. The clerk looked down at the gloves, picked one up, squeezed it, checked the brand. Everlast. Old ones. Seen some use. He set it back down with a small thud. "I can give you 75. Sarah's face fell. The number hit her like a physical blow. $75 for everything her father had been. For every morning he'd woken up at 5 a.m. to train before his construction shift. For every weekend he'd spent teaching kids in neighborhood gyms how to keep their guard up, how to move their feet, how to believe in themselves. Her voice barely above a whisper. Burke nodded. He'd heard variations of this line 1,000 times. Everything that came through his door had belonged to someone's father, someone's mother, someone's grandmother. Sentimental value filled his shop like invisible ghosts, but it didn't change the mathematics of resale. "Sentimental value doesn't change the resale," he said, not unkindly. "Just factually." Sarah swallowed hard. Her throat felt tight. 100. Please. I just need 100. Burke sighed, adjusted his glasses, looked at her more carefully now, saw the desperation she was trying to hide, the trembling in her hands she couldn't quite control. 80. Final. She looked down at the gloves again. Her hands began to shake more visibly now. And that's when the bell above the door rang. Sarah didn't look up right away. She was too focused on keeping herself together, too focused on the impossible math running through her head. $80 wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't cover the electric bill, wouldn't cover the late fees on her rent, wouldn't buy her enough time. But Burke's expression changed. His eyes widened just slightly. His spine straightened. His hands, which had been resting casually on the counter, suddenly moved to smooth down his shirt. Whoever had just walked in was someone. Sarah finally glanced over her shoulder. A man stood near the door. Tall, older, but still powerful in the way he carried himself. Broad shoulders that hadn't softened with age. Hands that hung at his sides with a fighter's relaxed readiness. He wore a dark tracksuit, sunglasses that hid his eyes, and a cap pulled low over his forehead. He didn't say anything. Just looked around the shop slowly, methodically, taking everything in. His gaze moved across the guitars on the wall, the jewelry in the cases, the racks of forgotten coats and instruments. Sarah turned back to the counter. Her heart was pounding now, but not because of him. She was running out of options, running out of time, running out of pieces of her life she could sell to keep herself afloat. "Please," she said to Burke, quieter now, more desperate. "Just 100. That's all I need." Burke was distracted now, still watching the man by the door. "I said 80. Her jaw clenched. She blinked hard, fighting back tears that had been threatening to fall since she'd walked in here an hour ago. She thought about her father. Thomas Calloway had been a boxer. Not famous, not rich, not someone whose name appeared in record books or whose fights played on late-night sports channels. But good, really good. He'd fought in small gyms across the Midwest in the 70s and 80s, VFW halls, high school gymnasiums, places where the ring was held together with duct tape and hope. He taught her how to throw a jab when she was 7 years old, how to keep her chin down and her hands up, how to move laterally instead of backing straight up. He'd told her stories about the ring, about discipline, about heart, about how the real fight wasn't against your opponent, it was against the voice in your head telling you to quit. He'd died 3 months ago, sudden. A stroke while he was sleeping. Peaceful, the doctors said. Like that made it hurt less. And now she was drowning. Medical bills he'd left behind that insurance didn't cover. Rent 2 months overdue with an eviction notice taped to her door. Her car had broken down last week. Something with a transmission. And she'd been walking everywhere since, her feet blistering in these old boots. She had no one. No family left. No savings. No backup plan. Just these gloves. They were the last thing of his she had that might be worth anything. She'd already sold his watch, the one his father had given him. His leather jackets, his tools, even the old transistor radio he used to listen to fights on. The one that only picked up AM stations and crackled with static but somehow still worked. This was it. The last piece. She looked at the gloves again, her vision blurred with tears she refused to let fall. 80, Burke repeated, his tone firm now. She nodded slowly, defeated, broken. Okay. But before she could say anything else, wait. Part 4. Steven Seagal's controlled response. Word count. 800 words. The voice came from behind her. Deep, calm, familiar in a way that made the air in the room shift. The kind of voice that carried weight without needing volume. The kind of voice that had spoken to presidents and paupers, to champions and challengers, to millions of people across generations. Sarah turned. The man in the tracksuit had stepped closer. He'd taken off his sunglasses, and that's when she saw his face. Her breath caught in her throat. It was Muhammad Ali, the greatest. The champion? The legend whose face had been on magazine covers and cereal boxes and murals painted on the sides of buildings and cities around the world. The man her father had talked about with reverence, whose fights he'd listened to on that old radio, whose poster had hung in their garage next to the heavy bag. He stood there, just 10 feet away, hands now resting in his pockets, eyes soft, but intensely focused. Burke stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a bang. "Mr. Ali, I didn't know you were." His words tumbled over each other. Ali raised one hand gently. Not rude, not dismissive, just quiet authority. The gesture of someone who'd spent a lifetime being recognized, being interrupted, being overwhelmed by people's reactions to his presence. Burke stopped talking mid-sentence, his mouth still open, his hand frozen in an awkward half-wave. Ali's gaze moved from Burke to Sarah, then down to the gloves sitting on the counter between them. He stepped closer, slowly, each movement deliberate, unhurried, not intimidating, just absolutely present in a way that made everything else in the room feel less important. "Those your father's?" he asked. His voice was softer than she expected. Gentler. There was a slight rasp to it, a thickness that came from years of Parkinson's affecting his speech. But the power was still there. The clarity, the intention behind every word. Sarah nodded. She couldn't speak, couldn't find words. Her entire vocabulary had evacuated her brain the moment she'd recognized him. Ali reached out slowly. His hand, large, scarred across the knuckles, trembling slightly, moved toward the gloves. His fingertips brushed the worn leather like he was touching something sacred. He picked up one glove, held it carefully in both hands, examining it the way a jeweler might examine a diamond. He looked at the stitching, the way the threads had loosened in places, but still held, the brand stamped into the leather, the way the padding had compressed and shaped itself over years of impact, creating a map of every punch, every combination, every round fought and survived. Then he looked back at Sarah. His eyes were kind, patient. Patient, like he had all the time in the world. "He box?" Ali asked. She found her voice. Barely. It came out thin and shaky. "Yes, in the 70s, nothing big, just local circuits. Ohio, Indiana, small gyms." Ali nodded slowly. "What was his name?" "Thomas Calloway." Ali repeated it quietly, like he was filing it away in a mental library of fighters he'd known, heard about, crossed paths with in the vast world of boxing. "Thomas Calloway." He thought for a moment. His brow furrowed slightly. Then he shook his head gently. "Honestly, don't know the name, but that don't mean he wasn't great." Those words broke something inside her. Tears spilled over. She couldn't stop them this time. She wiped at them quickly with the back of her hand, embarrassed, trying to maintain some composure in front of this man, this legend, this person who didn't know her or her father but was treating both with more respect than anyone had shown her in months. Ali set the glove down carefully on the counter, centered it perfectly, like its placement mattered. "Why you selling them?" he asked. The question was simple, direct, but not accusatory, not judgmental, just curious, like he genuinely wanted to understand. Sarah hesitated. Shame crawled up her spine. Shame at being here, at being desperate, at having to turn her father's memory into cash just to survive another month. I need the money," she said finally. Ali waited, didn't interrupt, didn't rush her, just gave her space. "For what?" he asked after a moment. "Bills, rent." Her voice cracked like thin ice under weight. "I don't have anything else." Ali was silent. He didn't look away from her. Didn't check his watch or the door. Didn't treat this like an inconvenience or an interruption to whatever he'd come here to do. He just stood there, present, listening. Burke stood frozen behind his bulletproof glass, completely unsure what to do or say, or whether he should even be in this room right now. Finally, Ali spoke again, his voice even softer now. "Your daddy teach you to fight?" Part 5, Tension and Witnesses, Word Count. 800 words, Sarah nodded, wiping at her eyes again. "A little." He used to say, she paused, steadying her voice. He used to say, "It's not about being the strongest. It's about showing up." Ali smiled. Small. Sad. The kind of smile that carried decades of understanding what those words really meant. Smart man. He looked at the gloves again, studied them like they held secrets only another fighter could read. The way the leather had creased, the way the laces had frayed, the ghost of every training session, every sparring round. Every moment Thomas Calloway had laced these up and decided to show up. Then he looked back at Sarah. "How much you need?" $100, she said quietly, almost apologetically. Ali didn't react, didn't laugh at the smallness of the amount, didn't show pity or condescension. His face remained calm, thoughtful, like she just told him something important that required careful consideration. He just reached into his jacket, pulled out a wallet, brown leather, worn but well-maintained, and took out 5 crisp $100 bills. Sarah's eyes went wide. Her hand flew to her mouth. "No, I can't, you can," Ali said simply, his voice firm but gentle. He placed the money on the counter between them, next to the gloves. The bills lay there, more money than she'd seen in months. "And you will." She shook her head violently, overwhelmed. Tears streaming freely now. "I don't. Why would you? I can't take your money." Ali leaned in slightly, not intimidating. just closer, making sure she could hear him clearly, making sure every word landed. His voice was low, strong, kind in a way that felt like being wrapped in something warm and safe. Because your father was a fighter, and fighters take care of fighters. The words hit her like a punch she didn't see coming. Her knees felt weak, her chest tight. Ali picked up both gloves, held them for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he handed them back to her. These stay with you. Sarah took them with shaking hands. She clutched them to her chest like a lifeline, like the last piece of solid ground in a world that had been crumbling beneath her feet for 3 months. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe, could only stand there crying while Muhammad Ali stood in front of her, patient and still, letting her have this moment without rushing it. Burke remained frozen behind his counter, witnessing something he knew he'd tell people about for the rest of his life. And then the door opened again. The bell rang, cutting through the thick emotional air. A younger man, maybe mid-30s, walked in holding a camera bag. He had a press badge clipped to his shirt. The lanyard read Louisville Courier-Journal. Freelance by the look of it. Probably local assignments, community stories. He'd been across the street at the coffee shop, laptop open, editing photos from a high school basketball game, when he glanced out the window and saw someone who looked exactly like Muhammad Ali walk into Burke's pawn shop. He'd grabbed his gear and crossed the street, half convinced he was wrong, that it was just someone who resembled the champ. But now he stood in the doorway, eyes wide, camera bag suddenly feeling heavy in his hands. Is that? His voice trailed off. Ali turned slowly, gave him a look, not angry. Not annoyed, just aware. The look of someone who'd been photographed and interviewed and followed for 50 years. The look of someone who knew exactly what was about to happen. The journalist froze. Mr. Ali? Wow, I'm sorry, I don't want to intrude, He was stammering now, star-struck professional composure evaporating. You with a paper? Ali asked calmly. Yeah, Louisville Courier. Freelance mostly, local stories. He held up his badge like proof. Ali nodded slowly, looked at Sarah, who was still clutching the gloves and the money, tears still wet on her face. Then he looked back at the journalist. His next words came slowly, deliberately, each one chosen with purpose. You write good stories. The journalist blinked, caught off guard by the question. I try, sir. I do my best. Ali gestured toward Sarah with one hand, the movement slow but unmistakable. Then right about her. The journalist looked confused. His eyes moved from Ali to Sarah and back again. I'm not sure I understand. Ali's voice grew stronger, more insistent. Her father was a boxer. Thomas Calloway, fought his whole life, died 3 months ago. She's here trying to sell his gloves to keep a roof over her head. He paused, letting that sink in. That's a story. Part 6, the shocking action word count, 800 words. The journalist stared at Sarah, really looked at her for the first time. Saw the tears, the worn clothes, the gloves pressed against her chest like they were the only thing keeping her from falling apart completely. He lowered his camera bag slowly, set it on the floor. His entire demeanor shifted from star-struck fan to working journalist who just stumbled onto something real. Can I? He hesitated, looking between Ali and Sarah. Can I ask you a few questions? Sarah looked at Ali, uncertain, vulnerable, not sure if she wanted her desperation documented, not sure if she wanted strangers knowing how far she'd fallen. Ali gave her the smallest nod, encouraging, supportive, like he was saying, trust this. Sarah nodded weakly. What happened next wasn't planned, wasn't orchestrated, wasn't some publicity stunt or calculated moment for the cameras. It was just real. The journalist pulled out a small notebook, a pen. He didn't go for his camera yet, didn't pull out recording equipment, just sat down on an old wooden stool near the counter and asked Sarah to tell him about her father. And slowly, haltingly, she did. Burke, still stunned, offered her a chair. She sat down, still holding the gloves, and the story came pouring out. Thomas Calloway had been a Golden Gloves contender in 1977. Made it to the regional finals in Cleveland. Lost a split decision that everyone at ringside thought he'd won. Never went pro after that. Got married instead. Had a daughter. Worked construction during the day, pouring concrete, framing houses. Working with his hands until they were calloused and scarred. But he never stopped boxing. He trained at night at a gym on the east side of Columbus, an old place called Rizzo's that smelled like liniment and decades of sweat soaked into the floorboards. He sparred with younger guys, kept his skills sharp, taught anyone who wanted to learn. On weekends, he taught neighborhood kids to box for free. Taught them discipline, respect, how to channel anger into something productive, how to take a punch and get back up, how to lose with dignity and win with humility. He believed in showing up, in doing the work even when no one was watching, in being there for people who needed someone to believe in them. He'd told Sarah once, when she was maybe 12 years old and struggling in school, feeling like she didn't fit anywhere, "The fight isn't in the ring, baby girl. It's in waking up every day and trying again." By the time she finished talking, her voice was hoarse, raw, but also lighter somehow, like speaking these things out loud had released some of the pressure that had been crushing her chest for months. The journalist was writing furiously, his pen moving across the page in quick, practiced strokes, and Ali stood nearby the whole time. Just listening. Not interrupting. Not making it about himself. Just bearing witness to this woman's story. To her father's legacy. To the quiet heroism of a man no one outside his community had ever heard of. By the time Sarah paused to catch her breath, there were other people in the shop. Someone walking by had seen Ali through the window, had texted a friend. That friend had texted someone else. Word spread the way it does in a city where Muhammad Ali was born and raised, where he was more than a celebrity. He was family. A small crowd had gathered outside on the sidewalk, phones out, murmuring, trying to see through the window, trying to understand what was happening. But they weren't pushing to get in, weren't being aggressive or intrusive. They were just there, present, like they could sense something important was unfolding and wanted to be part of it, even from a distance. Burke moved to the door, concerned about the crowd, but Ali shook his head gently. "Let them be," he said quietly. Inside the shop, the journalist had stopped writing. He looked at Sarah with genuine empathy, the kind that comes from recognizing someone's humanity, someone's struggle, someone's worth. "Thank you for sharing that," he said. "Your father sounds like he was an incredible man." Sarah nodded, unable to speak without crying again. The journalist looked at Ali. "Mr. Ali, can I ask why you—" Ali held up a hand. "This story ain't about me. It's about her. About her father. About all the Thomas Callaways out there who gave everything to this sport and never asked for nothing back." He paused, his voice growing stronger despite the tremor. "Those are the people we forget. The ones in the small gyms. The ones teaching kids for free. The ones showing up every day with no cameras. No glory, no money." His eyes moved back to Sarah. "Those are the real champions." Part 7 resolution, safety and moral word count. 700 words. 3 weeks later, Sarah started working at the gym. Ali had made good on more than just his promise. The phone call he'd made that day, standing right there in the pawn shop with everyone watching, had been to an old friend named Marcus Webb, who ran Webb's Boxing Academy on the south side of Louisville. A good gym, a clean gym, the kind of place where serious fighters trained alongside kids learning discipline for the first time. Marcus had offered Sarah a job on the spot. Front desk, scheduling, maybe some coaching if she wanted to learn, if she wanted to honor her father's legacy by passing on what he'd taught her. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and it came with something Sarah hadn't had in months. Stability. A place to be. A purpose beyond just surviving. She kept her father's gloves. Never sold them, never even considered it again. She had them mounted in a shadow box with UV protective glass, and she hung that shadow box on the wall near the main ring at Webb's gym, where everyone could see it, underneath. A small brass plaque that Marcus had engraved. Thomas Callaway, fighter, father, teacher, father, Teacher, it's not about being the strongest, it's about showing up. Every person who walked into that gym saw those gloves, saw that name, and many of them asked about him. Sarah would tell them stories about his fights, his dedication, his generosity, the way he'd believed in people when they didn't believe in themselves. The journalist's story ran 4 days after that afternoon in the pawn shop, front page of the local section. Then it got picked up online. Then it went viral. Not because of Ali. Those involvements certainly helped, but because it resonated. Because there were thousands of Thomas Callaways out there, thousands of forgotten fighters, forgotten teachers, forgotten heroes who'd given everything and gotten nothing back except the satisfaction of knowing they'd made a difference. Donations poured in, more than Sarah needed, more than she'd ever expected, enough to cover her father's medical bills completely, enough to pay off her back rent and get her car fixed, enough to set up a small fund in her father's name at Webb's gym to help other kids who couldn't afford training. But more than the money, more than the attention, more than any of that, people started sharing their own stories. Comments flooded the article, social media posts, emails sent directly to the newspaper. Stories about coaches and trainers and cornermen who'd changed lives. Stories about gyms in small towns. Stories about the backbone of boxing that nobody ever celebrated. The forgotten ones finally being remembered. Sarah realized something her father had tried to teach her all along, something she'd understood intellectually, but hadn't truly felt until that moment in the pawn shop when Muhammad Ali had stood in front of her and said, "Fighters take care of fighters. Strength isn't about wealth or fame or having your name in record books or your face on magazine covers. It's about showing up for each other. It's about seeing someone who needs help and deciding that their struggle matters, that their father's legacy matters. That they matter." Muhammad Ali never asked for recognition for what he did that day. Never did a follow-up interview. Never turned it into a photo opportunity or a press conference. He just did what came naturally to him, what he'd been doing his whole life. He saw someone who needed help. And he helped, because that's what fighters do. That's what champions do. Not just in the ring, but in life, in the small moments, in the pawn shops and street corners and quiet places where people are struggling and hoping that someone, anyone, will notice. Ali had noticed, and in noticing, in acting, in treating Sarah and her father's memory with dignity and respect, he'd reminded everyone who heard the story what true greatness actually looks like. It looks like showing up.